And it's interesting as we think about these nativity stories, we often think about Mary and baby Jesus. We think about the wise men, we think about the shepherds, the evil King Herod. We think about the angels. There's one character that sometimes sort of gets lost in the shuffle. And it happens to be that character, that individual, that Matthew chapter 1 focuses on. Matthew chapter 1 seems to focus on Joseph. And what this whole scenario means to Joseph and how he plays a part in it. And how he has to come to the realization of what part he plays in this. He encounters a tremendous crisis in his life here. And we know he's a righteous man and he's a godly man, but is he going to be able to submit his life to this crisis? Is he going to be able to be the kind of person that we hope he can be? Are we able to be the kind of people that Joseph was, that can deal with difficulties in the midst of crisis? So I want to go through Matthew chapter 1, and again, just pretend like you're reading it for the first time and see what is going on here. And I think the text somewhat is encouraging us to think about how these real people are feeling based upon the situations that they're being put into. Matthew chapter 1, verses 1 through 17 is a genealogy. We will not read everything, the entire thing. We will just kind of make some comments about it. And I'm sure you've read through some of this before, so this is not going to be a big surprise to you. Interesting, let's just jump over to verse 16. It says in verse 16, Jacob was the father of Joseph, Joseph the husband of Mary, by whom Jesus was born, who is called the Messiah. So what Matthew is going to do is trace the lineage of Joseph all the way back through David and all the way back in verse 1 to Abraham. And is going to say that Joseph's lineage that he passes on to his adopted son Jesus puts Jesus in that messianic line, as does his biology. Now, Jesus is adopted by Joseph, and yet he still benefits from Joseph's messianic lineage. So we see that in verse 1, for instance, of Matthew 1, the record sorry, of the genealogy of Jesus, the Messiah, the son of David, the son of Abraham. So we have some significant people in this lineup here. We have, this traces the lineage of Jesus from Abraham through David to Joseph. This is probably, by the way, an abridged lineage, as often happened in that day. They wouldn't mention every single ancestor in this lineage, but they would certainly hit the highlights. And obviously Matthew is trying to make a point here, that Jesus has messianic Davidic background. Joseph's lineage also shows us examples of people who also respond in different ways in crises. And I think that's interesting, because Joseph is about to be confronted with a crisis. For instance, look at verse 5. Verse 5 mentions Rahab. Interestingly enough, and I'll just say she's a woman of ill repute, apparently. She is not a Jewish person, yet incorporated, because of how she responded to a certain crisis that she went through, incorporated into the messianic lineage. Isn't that interesting? She's in Jericho, and everybody knows that God's people are coming, and they all are against this. They don't want this to happen, but she is given a unique opportunity by God to align with God's people, to trust in this God. And she does that, and she is saved because of that. She faces a crisis. She makes that decision to trust God and to follow God and to obey God, and she is incorporated into the Messiah's lineage. Verse 5 also mentions Ruth. At one point, and we won't go through the whole story, but at one point in Ruth's life, she is faced with a similar crisis. I could go back to my non-Jewish home of where she was born and where she was raised, or she could stay with her Jewish family that she was incorporated into, and more importantly, follow their God, the one true God. And she's at a point of crisis, and she makes that decision, and again, it's incorporated into the messianic line. You have some real winners in this lineup. You have, in verse 10, you have Hezekiah, who, not a perfect king, but all told is a fairly godly individual. The next one after Hezekiah, Manasseh, considered the most wicked king of both the southern kingdom of Judah and the northern kingdom of Israel. And here he is in the Messiah's line. At some point he made a decision to go a certain way with his life. And you know, we all have those kinds of decisions, to either follow or to reject. And he rejected. So it's interesting that, you know, in this lineage we have individuals who, like David and like Abraham, faced difficulties in their lives and were given a chance to either choose to follow or to disobey. And this brings us to, in verse 16, we come to Jacob, Joseph, the husband of Mary, and brings us to Jesus, who is called the Messiah. And in verse 17, he tells us about how he has divided these up. So these are the generations from Abraham to David. There are 14. From David to the deportation of Babylon, 14 generations. And from the deportation to Babylon to the Messiah, 14 generations. So Matthew has been bringing us from Abraham up to Jesus, but mentions Joseph and his significant role that he plays in this. And now in verses 18 through the rest of the chapter, we're going to focus on this familiar story about Joseph and about this significant crisis that he is about to go through. And I think what we see in verses 18 and 19, this, again, a very familiar story, but just to focus in on Joseph, we see Joseph as a man who wants to do what is right. Verses 18 and 19, it says, "Now the birth of Jesus Christ was as follows. When his mother, Mary, had been betrothed to Joseph before they came together, she was found to be with child by the Holy Spirit. And Joseph, her husband, being a righteous man and not wanting to disgrace her, wanted to send her away secretly." Verse 18 is basically an abridged version of almost a chapter and a half that Luke covers about how the angel came to Mary and how Mary responds, and about how, you know, all the dynamics here unfold. Matthew kind of summarizes that into one verse because he wants to cover, he wants to go a different direction. It's interesting in there, it mentions that they are pledged to be married, that they are betrothed. This is a word that actually means, it actually is related to the word for to remember. They are remembered to one another. They are engaged in a very close way. They have not consummated that yet. But this is more than just our engagements that we have today, which are a little more tentative, can be broken a little more easily. When they're betrothed in that culture, you remember that you are someone else's. Which makes unfaithfulness to that vow a very serious predicament, doesn't it? Unfortunately, we don't have some of those same convictions, but that was a very significant issue in their day. So they were betrothed to one another. They were remembered to one another, yet their union was not consummated. And yet, during this time, as it says at the end of verse 18, she is found to be with child by the Holy Spirit. Now, Joseph, as it says in verse 19, is a righteous man. He finds out about this, and he intends to break the betrothal and to put her away. The author kind of breezes over what we can only speculate would have been a very, very difficult conversation, where Mary and Joseph sit down together, and she says to Joseph, "I have something I need to tell you, but you've got to believe me, it's not what it sounds like." Can you imagine that conversation? You've got to believe what I'm saying to you. And she says the angel and the Messiah and the whole thing. And then she leaves it in his court. he does not, as far as I can tell from the text, he does not believe her. How do we know that? Because he intends to put her away. He considers what has happened here to be a disgrace. He does not want her to be disgraced. He wants to put her away secretly. So again, I just want you to stop. These are not robots. These are not people who do not have emotions and disappointments. Imagine Joseph, he's trying to start off his life, and maybe he's just started a career as a young man of that age would do, and then you just think about family, and he's wants to be married, and he wants to have children and raise a normal family, and that's what most of us want to do. And he's married, he's betrothed to Mary, this girl that he thought was very godly, and now his opinion of her is rather changed. And I bet he thinks about a lot of things he could do. I bet he's very angry. I bet he's very disappointed. And yet he wants to do the right thing for her. You know, this is the kind of thing that people will come up to him and say, hey, I thought you were betrothed to Mary. And he's got to tell the story. What happened? It's embarrassing. It's humiliating. I can't help but imagine that not only is he disappointed that this godly woman did this, but that she, from his perspective, I would imagine, that she lied about it with this angel story and all these things. This is a man going through a significant crisis. Disappointment, humiliation, anger. You can see, by the way, an angel had to come and talk to Joseph, don't you? I mean, he couldn't have gotten past this. If he's like you and me, he couldn't have gotten past this without an angelic visitation. And yet, it still says he wants to do the right thing. He does not want to disgrace her. He wants to send her away secretly. I find that staggering, a staggering testimony to the righteousness of this man, to the goodness of this man, to his understanding that he needs to do the right thing because of his God. So Joseph wants to do the right thing. He's feeling betrayed. He's feeling maybe put off. He's feeling disappointed. And yet he wants to do the right thing. And at that moment that he decides to do the right thing, something very amazing happens. Joseph realizes his role in the bigger picture. Verses 20 through 23. Let me read those verses for us. But when he had considered this, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared to him in a dream, saying, Joseph, son of David, do not be afraid to take Mary as your wife, for the child who has been conceived in her is of the Holy Spirit. She will bear a son, and you shall call his name Jesus, for he will save his people from their sins. Verse 22, the author goes on to comment about the prophetic value of this. Now all this took place to fulfill what was spoken by the Lord through the prophet. Behold, the virgin shall be with child and shall bear a son, and they shall call his name Emmanuel, which translated means God with us. So let's go back to verse 20. Something extremely interesting is happening at the beginning of verse 20. Again, remember that he probably thought of all kinds of things he could do in this situation. I mean, he could humiliate her or allow her to just be humiliated on her own for what she's done from his perspective. He could try to shield himself from some of the potential embarrassment of this situation. But he wants to protect her. I'm sure all kinds of options go flying through his mind, but verse 20 uses a very interesting word. It says, when he had considered this, and the word considered is enthumomai, which is used here and elsewhere, a few times in Matthew and a few times throughout the New Testament. It is not just considered several options. There's a word for to think or to picture certain options. Enthumomai seems to imply that he set his mind on a course of action that he was going to accomplish, but didn't yet accomplish it. He says, this is what I plan to do, even though he had not yet done it. Interestingly, as soon as he decided to do the right thing, the angel comes to him. I imagine in that conversation where Mary is telling Joseph about